Hello, my name is Bonnie. I live in Perth, Western Australia, on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I'm a mum of two tiny but very powerful humans, a wife to a very tall British man, a third-year midwifery student, and creator of the Making a Midwife podcast. The pandemic was hard on so many of us in so many different ways. I felt isolated. As a mum, as a student, as both of them combined, I felt like a terrible mother for having something outside of motherhood that I loved and dedicated time to. I felt like a deadbeat student for having kids and feeling like every assignment was squeezed out between feeding and cleaning and Duplo building and making meals and picking said meals up off the floor. I searched for resources that would provide a sense of companionship and unity while I was so isolated. Something that would make me have that, yeah, me too, feeling. But I couldn't find anything. So ever the if your situation sucks then change it person, I decided to create what I so keenly wanted to have. Making a Midwife started with a message to some friends, some willing volunteers to share their stories, and me sitting under a blanket in my son's cupboard on a Zoom call. We had an amazing response to the podcast, and Meg, my beautiful fellow student, came and joined the Making a Midwife team. We started sharing stories of students, but then realised the need to not only provide community and shared experience, but to also share research and broaden the knowledge of both students and anyone working in the birthing field. I reached out to registered midwives I knew and then decided to email Hannah Darlin after Meg, who is a world of knowledge when it comes to all things midwifery, suggested that she would be amazing to hear from. Hannah said yes. It was epic, and everything grew and grew from there. We now have over 35,000 listeners and such a wonderful, supportive community. The podcast has surprised us in so many ways. It's revealed the remarkable generosity of our midwifery community. From people like Sheena Byram, Rhea Dempsey, Hazel Keedle, Caroline Homer, and Rachel Reed, to the incredible students who take time out of their days filled with work and study and placement and kids to share their stories. The generosity has been incredible. And we've learnt so much, some of which I'm here to tell you about today. There is an unspoken but keenly felt divide between student and midwife. As students, we're there to learn, we're there to be taught, we're there to be under the knowledge of a guiding midwife. But sometimes this divide feels too great, and it means that as students we feel incredibly useless and in the way. Meg was told by a lovely preceptor that if you don't know what to do, then do what you know. And it's within this principle that I want to share how the podcast has highlighted where students and midwives can overlap, where we can lessen that divide and hold equal impact, and where if we don't know what to do, we can do what we know. This is the shared anatomy of students and midwives. Let's start with the voice. As students, so many of us feel that we lose our voice the moment that we enter the placement building. Maybe we don't know the names of the staff yet or the inside jokes that run through the wards. We second guess our answers to questions. We stop ourselves asking questions in case they're stupid. We hold back on suggestions of problem solving or actions to take because we don't have the same experience, the same knowledge and the wisdom that we assume our preceptors have. But there are ways in which our voices hold equal strength and validity. There are things we can say as students observing and working alongside midwives that wouldn't hold the same weight if they said it themselves. Sheena Byram was one of the first people I emailed about coming on the podcast. She responded with an emphatic yes, and I thought to myself, what on earth have I done? I can't do a Zoom in my messy house with my screaming toddler and my unwashed hair and my COVID brows with Sheena Byram. But she was so incredibly kind and gracious, and what she shared has resonated with so many listeners. She teaches that in encouragement and building up, our voices are equal, and that you don't need to be registered or qualified or in leadership to use your voice in the space of affirming others. And that as students, we don't need to wait to contribute to positive culture change in our health facilities. We can start right now. Here's what Sheena said.
And the other part to it is really concentrating on things that are positive rather than always looking at negative. So trying to really pull out a salutogenic focus, looking at well-being rather than always looking at risk, and also turning to your colleagues and seeing when something has happened that's really positive and giving them that affirmation, giving them that positive, authentic feedback. And you don't have to be in a leadership position to do this. You can be a student midwife, you can be a cleaner on the ward, you can be a maternity care support worker. You can be any position at all. And it definitely works and makes a difference. It has a ripple effect throughout shifts, throughout departments and throughout organisations. It is quite a remarkable intervention on reducing negative culture. A really lovely story, which I'll share with you. I worked with a consultant obstetrician, and she's still a good friend. She wasn't at this time. She was very senior obstetrician, and she's Dutch, and she was very, very matter of fact and very strict. I was working as a consultant midwife then, and it was my role to listen to women who'd had traumatic birth experiences. And I was in my room doing my sessions one day, and there was a woman outside crying. And when I went out to her, she told me that she'd just been in a consultation with a midwife and a senior doctor. And she'd told the doctor and the midwife that she wanted to labour in water. She was distraught, but she'd had her first baby. And when she'd had her first baby, she had a bicornuate uterus and her baby was breech. So she had a caesarean section. She was really disappointed that she had a caesarean, but she had horrendous backache this time, and so much so that she couldn't lift her baby out of the cot in the morning. She said, "There's no way I can lie on a bed to be monitored. I know I've had a previous caesarean, but I can't do it. I have to get in the water." And they just said, "Absolutely no way." And then I said, "Look, I'm just going to go and find a consultant who I know will listen to you and see what she thinks." So I went and found, she's called Rinika Shram. So she came in one of the consulting rooms, and I brought the woman in, and this is what the consultant did. She just lowered her chair to the same level as the woman. She smiled at her. She opened her records, but didn't read them. And she just said to her, "Just tell me what you're worried about. Tell me what you're sad about." So the woman just told her and all the stories she'd already said. And she just said, "Well, that's okay. Don't worry. You can have your baby. You can go in water. What we can do is we can put things in place to make it safe for you." So the woman left the room and she was totally relieved. And I just was like in awe and thinking, why doesn't this happen every time? Yeah. So I went back to her and I just said, "Can I just have a word with you, Rinika? I just wish I'd have had a camera in that room when you did that, because that consultation was just perfect. And the way you lowered your chair, the way you gave her eye contact, the way you listened to her, the way you've put a plan in place and not told her no, was just so beautiful. And I just want to know that I'm really impressed with what you've done." And she looked at me, went bright red, and neck went red, and she marched off. Anyway, so what happened then, a couple of weeks later, one of the other obstetricians came to my room and she said, "Oh, I've just been on a home visit because there was a complaint." And I went with Rinika. And when I came back, she said, "I can't believe it." She said, "Rinika's given me some amazing, really positive feedback. And I've never had that before. I've worked with her all these years and she's never ever said anything positive to me before." And she said, "I'm just so overwhelmed. I'm just thrilled, And I just thought, yeah, the ripple effect. She may have been embarrassed when I told her, but it obviously meant a lot to her. It obviously had an impact on her. And so what she did is she did it with someone else. That is a strategy that you can actually do to lift the culture. We have to look at when things are going right and to speak up about that.
Still hands. A few weeks after the podcast started, the Midwives Cauldron with Rachel Reid and Katie James launched, and Meg and I talked about how incredible it would be to get them on our podcast. Next thing I knew, I was beginning a Zoom with the beautiful Katie James. This episode has been one of the most impactful ones we've had. This is the one that we get sent messages after people listen saying, "This was amazing. It's reminded me why I want to be a midwife." There's one section in this episode that always connects with listeners, and it seems to be because it brings midwifery back to its core, its essence of being with women, truly with. Katie talks here through her experience of a home visiting service she provided during her time in Australia. She talked about the aspect of those home visits which were most important to her, which she saw made the most impact and what for her was true midwifery. Gloriously, for us as students, it's another way in which we can align with our registered midwives, knowing that these skills of stillness, of listening, of observing, of simply holding space are always in our scope. And one way we can do this is to fulfil the ever-important duty of saying yes to a cup of tea. Here's Katie's story.
We started home visiting, and I remember in the first few months coming back into the hospital and having several comments from other midwives who'd never worked outside of the hospital environment. And they were comments like, "So what do you do all day? You're just drinking cups of tea? God, you've got such a cushy job. You guys, that's all you do." And I remember the whole tea comment, and obviously I'm British, so of course I'll drink a cup of tea. And I had a student midwife with me, and she said to me afterwards, "Oh my God, you accept a cup of tea everywhere." And I went, "Why do you think I do that? It's not because I want a cup of tea, because we're having to find places to have a wee everywhere." So she said to me, "Why do you have a cup of tea?" And I said, "Think about it." And she thought, I said, "What do we do when we've got this hot cup of tea in our hands?" And she went, "We don't do anything." I said, "Exactly. Because then I'm sitting, the woman feels more confident. I've accepted something from her, so she feels she trusts me. It's hot tea, so I can't talk because I have to wait to drink my tea." And I listen to her. And then she tells me stuff. And sometimes I'm drinking my tea and I can keep drinking it. And so it doesn't look like an awkward silence. And then she opens up. And I said, and sometimes it takes 2 visits or 3 visits of me drinking the tea before she tells me that there's domestic violence going on, or that she's been not sleeping for days and she's having nightmares and flashbacks and she's got trauma. But if I don't allow that space by having that cup of tea, I miss it because I'm ticking off a list. Got to weigh the baby, got to do the heel prick test, got to check the breastfeeding. How's your lochia? How's your, let me feel your stomach. How are your stitches? Can I have a look? Okay, out the door. And she said, "We never get a lunch break." And I said, "I know, and that's not good. But I know that then I've done my job and I haven't missed something. I haven't missed the woman who sits there and doesn't know what to say and she's constantly looking at the clock. And I'm thinking, why is she looking at the clock all the time?" And then I start mentioning, "When's your boyfriend back?" "He'll come back anytime soon." And those little cues that tell us that there's something not right. The woman who's really starting to go into postnatal depression, or even the very rare occasions of psychosis. You don't see that if you do these perfunctory tick and flick. I've ticked the boxes. That's not midwifery for me. And so that's the reason why I drank a hell of a lot of very not good tea. But it was made with love. That for me are those parts of midwifery that we take for granted. And that's not just in birth. We need it just as much in the postnatal. That's worth its weight in gold.
Brave and vulnerable hearts. Bravery and vulnerability cannot exist one without the other. It takes bravery to be vulnerable, and to be brave is to choose to move within the spaces in which you are made vulnerable and feel exposed. The podcast has taught me that student midwives dwell in a space of vulnerability constantly, not always feeling brave about it, but somehow mustering up the courage to keep on going even though we know that we will fail at things and we feel so keenly exposed. The midwives that we aspire to be know vulnerability because they were students once too, and they carry that with them into employment. And when faced with a student, they're brave enough to meet us in our discomfort and create a safe space, much like they do with labouring women. The heart of midwifery is built on instantaneously raising up strong and trusting relationships to withstand the dynamic, unpredictable and ever-changing nature of birth. We have the choice to show up as students and midwives and to be courageously vulnerable with each other, with the women, with our communities. And the beauty in this is that it creates true connection, where people feel seen and still valued, where they can give and receive, where they can try and fail without judgment. Christian is a male midwife working in the remote and very remote areas of the Northern Territory. This segment from Christian's episode came about after I told him how scared I would be of making cultural mistakes if I worked with Aboriginal communities. His response describes brave vulnerability in its essence. He tries his best but makes mistakes and bears the consequences. And it's in his return and willingness to keep trying, to keep learning and to keep growing that the trust and connection is formed. Where there was uncertainty, safety is created. We know this is reflective of the student experience. We must keep going, keep coming back after each mistake and do everything we can to learn from it. But when I look at this story, and I mean really look, I can't help but notice the incredible way the community meets Christian with its own courage and vulnerability. He's not discounted or written off for his mistakes. Instead, he's met with forgiveness and the bravery of a community willing to teach, willing to provide the space in which he can continue to try. What epic courage and vulnerability is that? To meet someone in earnest where they fail and offer second, third, fourth chances, all the while saying, I'm vulnerable, but I trust you. Here's Christian's story.
I think it's good to think that you will make these silly mistakes, and that's how you learn. And you can imagine there's been a lot of people who come through here who've been shocking and made terrible mistakes.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really helpful to come with that kind of fear to begin with, because you want to do the right thing. And there's no way you could know everything to begin with. So you ask your Aboriginal colleagues you're working with, what should I do here? What should I do here?
Yeah.
A lot of people think that there's this obvious gap between us and them, and we have to bring them across the gap to us. But instead, you should be thinking about jumping into the gap with them and seeing where they're at and learning what it's like for them and their experience before you even begin thinking you're going to save the day or you're going to change things by bringing them to where you are. Yeah. It's going to meet them where they are and dwelling in that space. And you go to any new culture, language is always the key that unlocks everything. So you do what I do and you start learning basic phrases, the basic politeness, how to address people respectfully. And that gets you so far straight away. And it shows people that you care. And when they see that you care and you're sticking around, they'll invest back into you. And people take you aside and want to adopt you into their family or their cultural group, or they want to teach you language. You know, Bonnie, if you come here and you show that interest, the older ladies will take you on a Saturday and sit down with you and teach you their language. They'll tell you their stories and their dreamings. Like, the people are beautiful and they want to share. I think me as a guy coming into that space, you know, like I remember learning a particular language with one group, and I needed to learn things like it's inappropriate for me to talk about urine in front of women. So how do I ask the women about PV loss or about the urine? And when I started learning the word for the uterus, which is the same word as a crocodile nest, or learning the word for baby and boy and girl, I had to learn the word for, vagina, for example.
Yeah.
And when I figured out what that word was and said it, one of the old women slapped me. because as a man, I can't. That's so disrespectful for me. So I sat with one of the old women and I asked her to help me. She came up with a word for me to use for that, and it's Yotaboiwanga. And I didn't understand what it was for ages, but as I started learning more and more of the language, I realized that the word she gave me was baby house or baby home. I noticed that when I say that as a guy, the women look at me and they can see I'm trying to be respectful and they know exactly what I'm talking about. But because I'm a guy saying that, it's really important to them. And that I figured out new ways where I learned from others where I would say, look, I have to ask you a sensitive question now. And they'd say yes, and I'd bend my head right down near to them so I could just whisper in their ear without making eye contact. I'd ask them, about their urine or whatever the sensitive issue is, and then I'd wait, sometimes a minute, sometimes 2 minutes, and then I get this yes or no. In one of the communities I came to, one of the women said, she's a real prominent woman in front of all the other women, said, it's shame you coming here, you're a man, it's shame. But by the end of it, a few weeks in, some of the women pulled me aside and they said, look, I'm scared, but I trust you. You can help me, And then one of them in particular, she said she was really scared about her first baby. She went into early labour and was about to have it in the clinic, and we had to do a whole bunch of things and call an emergency evacuation aeroplane in, and she had to get on that. And she allowed me to check her, and that normally that would be shame, but she trusted me. And then when we got to the plane, a male doctor got off and she said, I'm not getting on that plane. And I said, why? And she said, because he's a man. And I said, but I'm a man. She goes, yeah, but we trust you. Older women here trust you. You get on the plane, you come with us to Darwin and birth us there. It was really moving to see that complete reversal. And that shows you that it's about trust, and relationship building.
The last piece of anatomy I want to share is that of a generous spirit. When I was toying with the idea of doing the podcast, I felt embarrassed, and I thought, why do I think this is something that I'm good enough to do? I told Meg about it, and she told me it sounded like a great idea. So I made the first episode. And then after the first episode, I told her I was still scared that it was stupid and nobody wanted it. And she told me that she loved it, and she encouraged me in every way. So I made more episodes because she gave me the space to be brave enough to create something and put it out in the world, even though I was scared it would fail. Almost every person that comes on the podcast tells us they don't think that they have anything particularly important to share, but they do it anyway. They're brave and vulnerable in their generosity of sharing. And for each and every single episode, we will always receive messages or comments on how important that person's story was for someone else. You may feel like you have nothing to give, but you never know what power your encouragement, your stillness, or your brave vulnerability will hold for someone until you share it. Everyone, each of you, student or midwife, you have value, and you have something valuable to give, to do. So if you don't know what to do what you know. Be kind, be still, be brave, be generous.